December of '89, I was standing outside the Echo Ridge General Store when I saw Marshal Silas Blackwood dragged into the street like a dog, blood trailing behind him in the snow. Hammond's men had him by the arms, and the whole town just watched while they threw that wounded lawman at the widow Granger's feet and told her to choose, sign over her land, or watch another man die on her property. Folks I'd known for 20 years, good Christian people, they just stood there with their heads down, too scared of Hammond's money to find their backbone. The widow, though, she looked at that dying marshal, looked at Hammond's hired killer with those pale, dead eyes, and I saw something in her face that made my blood run cold and hot at the same time. By dawn, either Hammond would own that lake shore, or we'd all learn what a woman with nothing left to lose could do to a man who'd already taken everything. Some said she was a witch. Maybe she was. Maybe that's exactly what Echo Ridge needed. Echo Ridge weren't much to speak of in December of 1889, just a lumber town clinging to the side of the Bighorn Mountains like a tick on a dog's back. Main Street was 3 blocks of false-fronted buildings and frozen mud, and the only thing folks talked about more than the weather was Oswin Hammond's money and how much of it you owed him. I was loading supplies into my wagon outside Wilson's General Store when I heard the commotion. Voices raised, not in anger exactly, but in that particular tone people use when they're watching something they know ain't right, but won't lift a finger to stop. The crowd had gathered near the lumber office, maybe 40 folks in their winter coats, breath fogging in the cold air. I pushed through to see what was drawing such attention, though I reckon I already knew. Hammond's business always drew a crowd, same way a hanging does. There in the center stood Eliza Granger, and even from 20 feet back I could see the fire in her eyes. She was a small woman, maybe 5'0" in her boots, but she held herself like she was 10 feet tall. Her dead husband's coat hung loose on her frame, patched at the elbows, and her dark hair was pulled back severe under a wool cap. She was holding a piece of paper in her hand that was shaking, not from fear, mind you, but from pure rage. "This ain't legal," she said, her voice cutting through the cold air like a blade. "Josiah paid cash money for that timber right. You got no claim to it." Across from her stood Carlton Price, Hammond's chief foreman, a barrel-chested man with a face like a shovel. He was smiling the way a cat smiles at a cornered mouse. "Mrs. Granger," he said, drawing out her name like it was something distasteful. "Mr. Hammond purchased your late husband's outstanding debts from the bank. Says right here you owe $600 plus interest. That timber cutting you want to do, well, that lumber belongs to Mr. Hammond until you settle your account." "That's a damn lie," Eliza shot back, and I saw several women in the crowd gasp at her language. "Josiah didn't owe nobody nothing. He was careful with money." Price shrugged, still smiling. "Well now, a dead man can't dispute the ledger, can he? And Mr. Hammond's been more than patient. 3 years he's waited for you to make good on these debts. 3 years. The crowd was silent now, watching. I recognized most of them. John Henderson, who'd lost his son in Hammond's mill. Martha Wilson, whose husband ran the store. Doc Beatrice Montgomery, standing off to the side with her medical bag. All of them looking at their boots, or the sky, or anywhere but at Eliza Granger's face. "This is robbery," Eliza said, quieter now, which somehow made it worse. "Plain robbery with legal papers instead of a gun. That's a serious accusation, ma'am," Price said. "Might want to be careful throwing words like that around. Mr. Hammond don't take kindly to slander." That's when young Clyde pushed through the crowd. The boy was maybe 9 years old, skinny as a fence rail, and deaf since birth. He'd been living rough since his mother died, sleeping in barns, eating scraps, the way unwanted children do in towns where charity runs thin. He walked right up to Eliza and tugged on her coat sleeve. She looked down at him, and something in her face softened just a fraction. The boy made signs with his hands. I didn't know what they meant then, but Eliza seemed to understand. She nodded once, firm-like, then turned back to Price. "I'll get your money," she said. "But that timber cutting happens this week or I lose my contract with the railroad. You know it and Hammond knows it. This ain't about debt. This is about taking what's mine." Price's smile widened. "Week from now, that timber'll belong to Mr. Hammond anyway, seeing as how your land's going up for auction on account of unpaid taxes. Didn't you get the notice?" The color drained from Eliza's face. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, and I heard Martha Wilson whisper, "Lord have mercy," under her breath. That's when Eliza did something nobody expected. She folded that piece of paper, put it in her pocket, then reached down and took young Clyde's hand. "This boy's coming with me," she announced to the crowd. "Anybody got objections?" Price's smile finally died. "Now hold on, Mrs. Granger. That's not what? Not proper? Not legal?" She looked around at all of us watching. "This child's been sleeping in your barns and eating from your garbage for 2 months, and not one of you Christian folk offered him a roof." "Well, he's got one now." She turned and started walking toward her wagon, the deaf boy's hand still in hers. The crowd parted like water around a stone. Price called after her, "Hammond won't like this, Mrs. Granger. Won't like it one bit." She didn't turn around, just kept walking, but her voice carried back clear. "Then tell Mr. Hammond he knows where I live. He's wanted my land for 3 years. Let him come take it himself if he's got the sand." I watched her climb onto that wagon with the boy beside her, and I thought to myself, that woman just declared war on the richest man in the territory, and she ain't got a dollar to her name or a friend in this town willing to stand with her. By God, I thought, watching her drive away into the winter afternoon, she's either the bravest woman I ever seen or the biggest fool. Turned out she was both, and that's what saved all of us in the end. The ride to Eliza's cabin took the better part of an hour, following the lake road until it petered out into little more than wagon ruts in the snow. The boy, Clyde, she'd learned his name from the signs he made, sat beside her wrapped in a blanket she kept for emergencies, watching everything with eyes that missed nothing despite his deaf ears. The cabin sat on a small point of land jutting into the lake, pines crowding close on 3 sides. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney, but the fire had died while she was in town. The place looked cold and unwelcoming in the failing afternoon light, and for a moment Eliza wondered what in God's name she'd been thinking, taking on a child when she could barely feed herself. But the boy was already climbing down from the wagon, his thin body moving with the careful efficiency of someone used to making himself useful. He looked at her questioningly, and she pointed to the woodpile. He nodded and went straight to it, arms loading up with split pine like he'd done it 1,000 times before. Inside, the cabin was exactly as she'd left it. Small, spare, clean. One room serving as kitchen, parlor, and sleeping quarters. Her bed in the corner. Josiah's tools still hanging on the wall where he'd left them 3 years ago. The charred doll on the mantel, watching everything with its burned-out eyes. Clyde stood in the doorway, arms full of wood, waiting for permission to enter. Something about that, the way he waited, the way he'd already known what needed doing, made Eliza's throat tight. "Well, come on then," she said, forgetting for a moment he couldn't hear. She waved him in, and he carried the wood to the hearth, stacking it neat and careful before looking to her for what came next. That first evening set the pattern. Eliza got the fire going while Clyde swept the floor without being asked. She cooked cornmeal mush and the last of her venison, and the boy ate like he was storing up for winter, which she supposed he was. When she pulled out a straw pallet and blankets for him to sleep on, his eyes went wide like he'd been handed gold. He made signs at her, urgent, questioning, and she wished to hell she knew what he was asking. But then he touched his chest, pointed at the pallet, and raised his eyebrows, asking if it was really for him. "Yes, boy," she said, speaking slow even though it made no difference. "It's yours. Long as you're here, that's your bed." The smile that broke across his face near about broke her heart. Days fell into rhythm. Eliza would wake before dawn to tend the fire, and by the time she'd gotten coffee boiling, Clyde would be up too, pulling on his too-thin coat to help with morning chores. He learned fast how she liked the kindling split, where the water bucket went, how to scatter corn for the chickens she kept in a small coop out back. The boy had a gift for observation. He'd watch her hands when she worked, memorizing the pattern of her movements. Within 3 days, he could start a fire as good as she could. Within a week, he'd figured out how to help with her trap lines, his young eyes spotting snares in the snow she'd have missed. Evenings, she taught him letters. She'd draw them in the ashes of the hearth with a stick, and he'd copy them with such fierce concentration it made her chest ache. He already knew some signs for words, and slowly, painfully slowly, They began to build a language between them. She learned that his mother had died in childbirth, that he'd never known his father, that the women in town had passed him between households like an unwanted puppy until nobody would take him anymore, that he'd been living in Jacob Wilson's barn until Wilson ran him off 2 weeks ago. It was Wilson himself who came calling on the 5th day, riding up in his delivery wagon with supplies she hadn't ordered and couldn't afford. "Mrs. Granger," he said, not quite meeting her eyes as she stepped onto the porch, "thought you might be running low on some things." "I didn't order nothing, Mr. Wilson." "No, ma'am. But seeing as how you took on the Henderson boy," he caught himself. "Clyde, I mean, seeing as how you're feeding an extra mouth now, thought you might could use some help." Eliza crossed her arms. "That's real Christian of you, considering you ran him out of your barn not 2 weeks past." Wilson had the grace to look ashamed. "Yes, ma'am. I ain't proud of that. My wife, she said—" He stopped, shook his head. "Ain't no excuse. I should have done right by the boy." "And now you want to do right by bringing me charity?" "Not charity, ma'am. More like making amends." He gestured to the wagon. "Flour, salt, coffee, some salt pork. Already paid for. Won't take it back, so you might as well use it." Eliza studied him hard. Jacob Wilson had been the first to turn his back on her after the fire, the first to refuse her business. But there was something in his face now. Fear, maybe, or shame, or both. "Why?" she asked simply. He glanced around, like checking if anyone was watching, then leaned close. "Because Hammond's men been asking questions in town. About you, about that boy, about who's been friendly with you." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Mrs. Granger, there's talk, bad talk. You need to be careful." "What kind of talk?" "The kind that comes before torches and rope," he said, and there was no mistaking the fear in his voice now. "The kind Hammond's good at stirring up when he wants something." That's when Clyde came running from behind the cabin, signing frantically. Eliza didn't need to understand all the words to get his meaning. Someone was coming. Multiple someones. Jacob Wilson's face went white. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. "They followed me." Through the trees came the sound of horses, at least 4, maybe more, moving at a deliberate pace, not hurrying, not hiding, coming with purpose. Eliza's hand went to the rifle by the door. "Mr. Wilson, I suggest you leave. Now." "I'm sorry," he said, climbing back on his wagon. "I'm so damn sorry." But he didn't leave. He sat there on his wagon, frozen, as Hammond's men emerged from the tree line and spread out in a semicircle around the cabin. 6 of them, all armed, and in the center, sitting easy in his saddle like he owned the world and everything in it, was Carlton Price. "Mrs. Granger," he called out, voice pleasant as Sunday church. "Mr. Hammond sent me to discuss your situation. He's a reasonable man, willing to help you out of this unfortunate predicament you've gotten yourself into." Eliza raised her rifle to her shoulder. "My property, get off it." Price smiled. "Now that's just the thing, ma'am. According to territorial law, it ain't your property no more. Auction's tomorrow, but Mr. Hammond's willing to settle your debts tonight. Cash money, more than fair." Behind her, she felt Clyde press against her back, small and trembling, but not running, not hiding. "And if I refuse?" Price's smile widened. "Well now, that's where things get complicated. See, there's been complaints about you harboring that boy. Folks say it ain't proper. A woman alone taking in a male child not her own. Questions about your moral fitness." The words landed like physical blows. Eliza felt rage boil up in her chest, hot and dangerous. "Furthermore," Price continued, "there's concern about the boy's welfare. Deaf child living out here in the wilderness. No proper schooling, no male influence. Territory's got laws about such things, child welfare laws." "You son of a—" "So here's Mr. Hammond's offer," Price talked over her. "You sign the deed tonight, take his money, and the boy goes to a proper Christian home in town. Everybody wins. Everybody except me and Clyde." "Well now, Mrs. Granger, seems to me you're the one being unreasonable. Mr. Hammond's trying to help. Hate to see what happens if you refuse his generosity." The other riders had spread wider now, flanking the cabin. One was carrying a torch despite the daylight. The message was clear. Eliza's finger found the trigger. You tell Hammond I'll see him in hell before I sign 1 inch of this land over to him." Price sighed like he was disappointed. "Thought you might say that. Shame, really." He turned his horse. "We'll be back tomorrow, Mrs. Granger, after the auction, with the sheriff and proper papers, and we'll be taking that boy into protective custody. For his own good, you understand." They rode away slow, letting the threat sink in. Jacob Wilson's wagon followed, the man's face a mask of guilt and fear. Inside the cabin, Clyde tugged on Eliza's sleeve. He pointed at the riders, then made a sign she'd learned meant bad. Then he pointed at her, at himself, at the cabin, and pressed his small hands together, staying together. "Yes, boy," she said, though her voice shook. "We stay together. Come hell or high water, we stay together." But as she watched Hammond's men disappear into the trees, she knew the hell was coming, and it was coming tomorrow. The auction was set for noon on the courthouse steps, and by 11:30, near about the whole town had gathered to watch. Not because they cared about a widow's land, but because watching someone lose everything is cheaper than a theater show and twice as entertaining. I stood at the back of the crowd, close enough to see but far enough to keep my shame private. Eliza arrived in her wagon with young Clyde beside her, and you could feel the crowd's mood shift, part curiosity, part something uglier. Women pulled their children closer. Men muttered to each other behind their hands. Sheriff Cobb stood on the courthouse steps, a thick-necked man who'd worn the badge for 15 years and Hammond's leash for most of them. He held up a piece of paper and read in a voice loud enough to carry, "By order of the Territorial Court, the property known as the Granger Homestead, comprising 40 acres of lakeshore and timber rights, is hereby offered for public auction to satisfy outstanding debts." Eliza climbed down from her wagon, helping Clyde after her. The boy stayed close to her side, his eyes darting around at all the staring faces. She walked straight up to those courthouse steps like she owned them. "I'm here to contest this auction," she called out. "Those debts ain't legitimate. My husband paid cash for that land, and I got witnesses who'll say so." Sheriff Cobb looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, the court's already ruled. The court ruled based on forged documents from Hammond's bank." Her voice cut through the crowd murmur. "I want a real investigation. I want someone who ain't on Hammond's payroll to look at those ledgers." That's when Carlton Price stepped forward from the crowd, all smiles and false concern. "Mrs. Granger, nobody's questioning your husband's character, God rest him. But facts are facts. The bank's got signed notes. Your husband borrowed money for seed and equipment. It's all documented proper." "Lies," Eliza said flatly. "Josiah kept records. I got them at home." "Do you now?" Price's smile widened. "Because I was under the impression your cabin suffered some water damage last week. Shame about those papers getting ruined." The crowd stirred. I felt my hands ball into fists. Everyone knew Hammond's men had been seen near her property. Everyone knew, and everyone stayed silent. "Regardless," Sheriff Cobb said, clearly wanting this over with, "we got another matter to address." He pulled out a second document. "I got a petition here signed by concerned citizens regarding the welfare of the minor child in Mrs. Granger's care. Territory law requires proper accommodations for orphaned children, and—" "His name is Clyde," Eliza interrupted. "And he's got proper accommodations. He's got a roof and food and someone who gives a damn whether he lives or dies, which is more than this town offered him." "The law requires a male guardian for a boy child," Cobb continued, "and proper Christian education. There's questions about whether a woman living alone—" "Questions from who?" Eliza demanded. "From Hammond? From the same man trying to steal my land?" Doc Beatrice Montgomery pushed through the crowd then, her medical bag in hand and something fierce in her eyes. "I've examined the boy," she called out. "He's healthy, well-fed, and showing no signs of neglect or abuse. In my professional opinion, he's better cared for now than he was living in your barns." She looked around at the crowd. "All of your barns." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few people had the grace to look ashamed, but Price wasn't done. "Doc, nobody's questioning the widow's intentions, but the law's clear. The boy needs to be placed with a proper family." He gestured, and two men stepped forward, Reverend Walsh and his wife, both wearing expressions of pious concern that made my stomach turn. "We're prepared to offer the child a Christian home," Reverend Walsh announced. Proper schooling, moral guidance. Clyde made a sound then, not words, but a cry of pure fear. He grabbed Eliza's hand and pressed himself against her side, shaking his head violently. The boy might not hear, but he could read intentions clear enough. Eliza wrapped her arm around him. "He ain't going nowhere, Mrs. Granger," Sheriff Cobb said, and there was something in his voice, not quite sympathy, but close. "The law." "Damn your law." Eliza's voice cracked like a whip. "This boy's mother died alone and scared because none of you would help her. He's been starving in your streets for months because none of you would feed him. And now you want to take him from the one person who gave him shelter?" She looked around at all those watching faces. "Which one of you fed him? Which one of you offered him a blanket? Any of you?" Silence, heavy and shameful. "That's what I thought," Eliza said quietly. "You want to take him, Sheriff? You're going to have to shoot me first." The crowd gasped. Several women clutched their chests. Reverend Walsh sputtered about blasphemy and sin. But I saw something else. Saw Martha Wilson's hand go to her mouth, saw tears in her eyes. Saw John Henderson take a step forward, then stop himself. Saw Doc Montgomery nod once, firm and approving. And I saw Jacob Wilson, standing at the edge of the crowd, his face white as snow, watching everything with the look of a man whose conscience was finally eating him alive. Price laughed, breaking the moment. "Well now, that's quite a speech, Mrs. Granger, but threats won't change the law." He nodded to Sheriff Cobb. "Proceed with both matters, auction and custody." "Bidding starts at $400, Cobb announced, clearly wanting this done. "Do I hear $1,000? A voice called from the back of the crowd. Every head turned. Through the gathered townspeople walked a man I'd never seen before. Tall, lean, wearing a badge that caught the winter sun. He had a pronounced limp and carried himself like someone who'd seen hard years and survived them. "Name's Silas Blackwood," he said, voice carrying across the suddenly silent crowd. "United States Marshal. And I got questions about this auction, Sheriff Cobb. Questions that need answering before any more property changes hands in this territory." Hammond's men tensed. Price's smile died like a candle in wind. And Eliza Granger, who'd stood alone against a whole town, finally had an ally. But as Silas Blackwood's eyes swept the crowd and landed on Carlton Price, I saw something pass between them, recognition and hatred, and the promise of violence to come. "Furthermore," Blackwood continued, pulling a document from his coat, "I got a federal warrant here for the arrest of Francis Reed, wanted for arson and murder across 3 territories, and I got reason to believe he's been operating in Echo Ridge under Hammond's employment." The crowd exploded into noise, shocked exclamations, denials, questions shouting over each other. And in the chaos, I saw Price back away, hand moving toward his gun, saw Sheriff Cobb's face go red with fury or fear or both. The marshal had just declared war on Hammond's empire in front of the whole town. And we all knew, every last one of us, that blood was coming. That evening, Marshal Blackwood followed Eliza's wagon back to the cabin, riding a borrowed horse that looked as tired as he did. His leg was giving him trouble. I could see it in how he favored the left side dismounting. But he didn't complain, just tied his horse and helped Clyde carry water from the lake while Eliza got a fire going. Inside, the 3 of them moved around each other like they'd been doing it for years instead of hours. Eliza cooking salt pork and beans, Clyde setting out tin plates, Blackwood checking the cabin's defenses, windows, doors, sightlines, with the automatic efficiency of a man who'd survived too many ambushes to take safety for granted. "They'll come tonight," he said finally, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight. "Price won't wait. My showing up with that warrant rattled them bad." Eliza ladled beans onto plates. "Let them come. This is my land and I'm staying on it. Ma'am, with respect, you don't know what you're up against. Hammond's got maybe 20 men on his payroll, all of them willing to do whatever he pays for. And Francis Reed," he stopped, jaw tight. "Reed don't care about money. He likes the work, likes watching things burn." "Then why ain't you arrested him yet?" The question came out harder than she meant it. Blackwood's eyes went distant. "Been trying for 3 years. He smoke, there 1 minute, gone the next. Leaves bodies behind but never evidence. Nothing that'll stand up in court. He looked at Clyde, who was watching their lips intently, trying to follow the conversation. How much does the boy understand? More than you'd think, Eliza said. He reads people better than most folks with working ears. As if proving her point, Clyde suddenly stood, walked to the window, and pointed outside. His hands moved in urgent signs. What's he saying? Blackwood asked. Something's wrong with the animals. They went to the window. Outside, the chickens that should have been roosting were scattered and agitated, making that nervous clucking sound that means predator nearby. Further out, at the tree line, Eliza's old hound dog stood rigid, hackles raised, staring into the darkening woods. Could be a fox, Eliza said, but her hand was already reaching for her rifle. Could be, Blackwood agreed, drawing his revolver. But foxes don't usually bring friends. That's when they heard it. Distant but unmistakable. Horses. Multiple horses, moving slow and deliberate through the forest. Not trying to hide, wanting to be heard. Clyde's hand found Eliza's, his grip tight. She squeezed back, trying to give comfort she didn't feel. How many you reckon? She asked. Blackwood cocked his head, listening. 6, maybe 8. He moved to the door, checking the bolt. They'll try to talk first. Offer you one last chance to sign the deed. When you refuse, and you will refuse, that's when things turn ugly. I got Josiah's old Sharps rifle, Eliza said, and enough ammunition to make them think twice. Ma'am, you can't shoot your way out of this. They'll burn you out, then claim you fired first. Sheriff Cobb will back their story, and you'll lose everything, including your life. So what do you suggest, Marshal? Run? Leave everything my husband built? Before he could answer, torches appeared at the tree line. 1, then 3, then 6 flickering lights spreading out in a semicircle around the cabin. The horses stopped just inside the tree cover, far enough back to be hard targets but close enough for their message to be clear. Carlton Price's voice carried across the snow. Mrs. Granger, Marshal Blackwood, let's talk reasonable, like civilized people. Blackwood opened the shutter just enough to call back. You want civilized. Send your men home and come to town tomorrow. We'll talk at the courthouse with the territorial judge. Laughter from the darkness. Multiple voices, cruel and confident. See, that's the problem, Marshal, Price called. Ain't gonna be no judge. Ain't gonna be no trial. Mr. Hammond's done being patient. A pause. Last chance, widow. Sign the deed and walk away. We'll even let you keep the boy. Hammond's feeling generous. Tell Hammond to go to hell, Eliza shouted back. More laughter. Then Price's voice turned cold. Have it your way, boys. Light it up. What happened next happened fast. 4 of the riders spurred forward, torches held high. They weren't heading for the cabin. They were heading for the chicken coop, the woodshed, the small barn where Eliza kept her wagon. Blackwood fired twice. One rider's torch went flying as he grabbed his shoulder, but the others reached their targets and threw their flames. The woodshed caught first, dry timber exploding into fire. Then the coop, chickens screaming and scattering. The barn's hayloft bloomed orange against the night sky. Clyde was signing frantically, the same gesture over and over. Eliza understood. They're burning everything, everything but the cabin. They want you to watch it all go, Blackwood said grimly. Want you to know what's coming for you next. Outside, Price was laughing. That's a taste, widow. Your animals burning, your property burning. Sign the deed, or tomorrow night it's the cabin, with you and that boy inside. The flames climbed higher, casting dancing shadows across the snow. Smoke rolled thick and black toward the cabin. Through the chaos, Eliza saw Jacob Wilson's wagon appear on the road, saw him see the fires, saw him turn his horses around and flee without even slowing down. Everybody sees, she whispered, and nobody helps. That's when Clyde tugged her sleeve and pointed toward the lake. Through the smoke and flame, she could just make out movement on the ice, more riders coming from the direction of town. At least a dozen torches, moving in formation. Blackwood's face went white. That's not Hammond's men. That's half the town. Coming to help? Eliza asked, desperate hope in her voice. No, ma'am. His voice was hollow. coming to make sure Hammond's justice gets done. They're bringing a mob. The riders on the ice kept coming, torches reflecting off the frozen surface like hellfire made solid. And at their head, clearly visible in the firelight, rode Sheriff Cobb himself. Behind them, Eliza's world burned. In front of them, the mob approached, and young Clyde pressed against her side, trembling but not crying, because even a deaf 9-year-old boy knew what came next. "We got maybe 10 minutes before they surround us," Blackwood said, reloading his revolver with practiced hands. 10 minutes to decide, surrender and hope for mercy, or make our stand and go down fighting. Eliza looked at the marshal, then at Clyde, then at the flames consuming everything Josiah had built with his own hands. "Reckon there ain't no mercy coming from that mob," she said quietly. "So I guess we fight." Outside, the riders on the ice drew closer, their torches reflecting in a dozen pairs of hate-filled eyes, and the winter wind carried the smell of smoke and the promise of more burning to come. What saved us that night weren't bullets or bravery. It was pure luck and Doc Beatrice Montgomery's backbone finally showing up when it mattered. She came riding hard through that mob on the ice, her medical bag bouncing on her saddle, shouting loud enough to wake the dead. "Sheriff Cobb, there's been a shooting in town. Multiple casualties. Need every man with a badge." It was a lie, of course, but Cobb didn't know that, and neither did the mob behind him. They milled around confused while Doc pushed through to the cabin, her horse's breath fogging white in the firelight. "Mrs. Granger," she called. "I got injured men need tending. You and that marshal best come quick." Blackwood understood first. "Play along," he muttered to Eliza. They emerged from the cabin with Clyde between them, and Doc made a show of giving medical orders while edging them toward her wagon that she'd left at the tree line. The mob watched, uncertain, as Hammond's men tried to figure out if they should stop a doctor responding to an emergency. By the time Sheriff Cobb realized he'd been played, they were already disappearing into the forest, Doc's wagon rattling over frozen ruts, while behind them the flames from Eliza's outbuildings painted the night sky orange. Doc drove them to a trapper's shelter she knew about, maybe 5 miles northeast of the lake. Weren't much, just 4 walls and a roof, chinked logs keeping out the worst of the wind, but it was hidden and it was safe, at least for the night. Inside, Eliza finally let herself shake, not from cold, though it was bitter, but from the weight of everything finally crushing down. She sank onto a rough-hewn bench and put her face in her hands. Clyde was beside her instantly, his small hand on her arm. When she looked up, he was signing something over and over, a gesture she'd learned meant safe, and another that meant together. "Yes, boy," she whispered. "We're safe. We're together." But the boy wasn't satisfied. He took her hand and pressed it flat against his chest over his heart. Then he took her other hand and put it on his own head. His eyes, solemn and too old for 9 years, held hers as he made a new sign. Fingers interlaced, unbreakable. "I think he's asking," Blackwood said quietly from where he was tending the fire, "if you'll keep him. Permanent-like." Eliza's throat closed up. "Boy, I got nothing to offer you. No home, no money, nothing but trouble." Clyde shook his head hard. He pointed at her heart, then at his own, then made that interlaced gesture again. He didn't need things. He needed her. "Lord help me," Eliza said, pulling the boy into her arms. "Yes, you're mine and I'm yours. Far as I'm concerned, you're my son now and anybody wants to take you answers to me." She felt him shudder against her, not crying because he made no sound, but his thin shoulders shook with the force of something finally breaking free. 3 years of being unwanted, and now someone claimed him. Doc Montgomery cleared her throat. "About that," she said, rummaging in her bag. "There's precedent. Old territorial law, back from when this was still trading country." She pulled out a worn book. "Child without kin can be claimed by blood oath before witnesses, binding as any legal adoption, maybe more so. The tribes did it that way for generations, and the territorial courts still honor it." Blackwood looked up sharply. "You saying what I think you're saying, Doc?" "I'm saying if Mrs. Granger wants to make this boy her legal son, we can do it right here, right now. I witness it, Marshall witnesses it, and it's done. Hammond can't touch him then, can't claim the boy needs a proper home. He'd have one, legal and binding." Eliza stared at her. Why are you helping us? 3 years you kept quiet about what you saw. Doc's face crumpled. 3 years I've been a coward. But when I saw that mob tonight, saw what this town's become, she shook her head. I'm done being afraid. Jacob Wilson died trying to do right. Least I can do is live trying to do the same. So there in that cold shelter with firelight casting shadows on log walls, Doc Montgomery spoke the old words and Eliza repeated them, her hand on Clyde's head and her voice steady. I claim this child as my own blood. I will feed him, shelter him, protect him with my life. His enemies are my enemies. His future is my future. By my word and before these witnesses, he is my son. Clyde couldn't hear the words, but he felt them. Felt them in how Eliza held him, in how Blackwood gripped both their shoulders, in how Doc wrote it all down in her medical journal with shaking hands and the date and her signature as witness. For one brief moment, in that cold shelter with everything lost behind them and danger waiting ahead, they were a family. Then came the knock at the door. Sharp, urgent, wrong. Blackwood had his gun drawn before the second knock. Who's there? Jacob Wilson, came the whispered reply. Please, I got information. About Reed. They let him in, pale, sweating despite the cold, looking like death itself. Hammond's bringing Reed in tomorrow, Jacob gasped out. Not just to burn you out, to make an example. Public execution, he's calling it. Says he'll burn anyone who stands with you. He looked at Doc. Your clinic's already marked. And the Henderson place. And mine. What's left of it? How many buildings? Blackwood demanded. 10, maybe more. He's going to burn half the town to prove nobody crosses him. Eliza felt Clyde press against her side. Her son now. Her responsibility. Then we end this, she said quietly. Tomorrow. We end Hammond, or he ends all of us. Outside, wolves howled in the distance, and the wind carried the smell of smoke that would haunt Echo Ridge for years to come. Jacob didn't stay long. Too dangerous, he said, Hammond's men watching his every move. But before he left, he pressed a folded paper into Blackwood's hand. Ledger pages, he whispered. 3 years of documentation. Every fire, every payoff, every piece of land Hammond stole. It's all there. After he slipped back into the darkness, the four of them, Eliza, Blackwood, Doc, and young Clyde, sat around that struggling fire and looked at those pages, names and dates and amounts that added up to 15 families destroyed, 43 people dead, and a fortune built on ash and bone. This is enough, Blackwood said, voice tight with something between hope and rage. This gets Hammond hanged. Reed, too. If we live long enough to present it, Eliza replied. They took turns keeping watch that night. When it was Eliza's turn, Clyde wouldn't sleep, just sat beside her at the small window watching the darkness. She put her arm around him, her son now, legal and binding, and felt him relax against her side. Blackwood was supposed to be sleeping, but she heard him stirring on his pallet. Can't rest? She asked quietly. Thinking about my sister, he said, Isabella. Reed burned her alive in Dakota Territory 3 years back. She was a school teacher. 23 years old. His voice was hollow. I've been chasing him ever since. Every time I get close, he slips away. Every time I think I got him cornered, Hammond's money buys him free. Not this time, Eliza said. You don't know that. No. But I know this. I'm done running, done being afraid. Whatever comes tomorrow, I face it standing up. Clyde must have felt something in how she held him, because he looked up at her and signed, Brave. Not brave, boy, she said, though he couldn't hear. Just tired of being scared. Dawn came cold and clear. They'd just gotten coffee boiling when they heard horses, multiple riders approaching fast. Blackwood grabbed his rifle, Doc her medical bag like it might shield her, and Eliza pulled Clyde behind her. But the voice that called out wasn't Carlton Price or Sheriff Cobb. Mrs. Granger, Marshal, it's John Henderson. I got people with me, friendly people. They emerged cautiously to find maybe 20 townspeople on horseback and in wagons. John Henderson in front, his crippled son beside him. Martha Wilson with her husband's old hunting rifle. 3 families from the East Farms that Hammond had been pressuring. Even young Deputy Collins, who'd been under Sheriff Cobb's thumb for 2 years. "We're done," Henderson said simply. "Done watching Hammond destroy this town. Done pretending we don't see what's happening." He gestured to the others. "Doc Montgomery came through town last night, told folks what Hammond's planning. Burning houses, burning people, making examples." Martha Wilson spoke up, her voice shaking but determined. "My Jacob died trying to stand against Hammond alone. We should have stood with him. Should have stood with you, Mrs. Granger, 3 years ago when your family burned. We were cowards then." Her eyes were wet. "But we ain't cowards today." Eliza felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been frozen solid since the night she'd stood alone watching her world burn while a whole town looked away. "You understand what you're risking?" Blackwood asked. "Hammond's got 20 armed men. Reed's a killer. This could end with all of you dead." "Then we die on our feet," Henderson said. "Better than living on our knees." Deputy Collins cleared his throat nervously. "Sheriff Cobb's still with Hammond, but I got the keys to the weapons locker at the jail, and I got 4 other deputies willing to stand with us instead of him. It ain't much, but it's everything," Eliza said quietly. They spent the morning planning. Henderson knew the terrain around Hammond's lumber mill where Reed was supposedly holed up. Collins knew which of Hammond's men were true believers and which were just scared workers who'd run if given the chance. Doc knew which townspeople had medical training to help with the wounded that would surely come. And Blackwood knew how Reed operated, knew he'd want a spectacle, knew he'd choose a public place, high visibility, maximum terror. "He'll burn something in town first," the marshal said. "Daytime, when everyone can see. Make sure the whole territory knows what happens to people who cross Hammond. Then tonight, he'll come for the rest of us." "So we don't wait for tonight," Eliza said. "We end it this afternoon. On our terms, not his." They were loading rifles and checking ammunition when Clyde suddenly gripped Eliza's arm. He was pointing toward town, where a column of black smoke was rising into the clear winter sky. Deputy Collins pulled out a spyglass, looked, then lowered it slowly. His face had gone white. "It's the church," he said. "They're burning the church, in broad daylight. And there's people gathered. Looks like half the town, forced to watch." Hammond's making his statement. Through the spyglass, Eliza could see them, tiny figures surrounding the blazing building, Hammond's men keeping them penned in, forcing them to witness what happened to a town that harbored rebels. And there in the center, clearly visible even at this distance, stood a man in a fine coat beside a smaller figure whose pale eyes would be watching the flames with professional interest. Hammond and Reed, together, in the open. "They're not expecting us to attack," Blackwood said slowly. "They think we're still running. Think we're scared." "Are we?" Henderson asked. Eliza looked at the smoke, then at Clyde, her son, then at the people who'd finally found their courage. "No," she said. "We ain't scared no more." She kissed Clyde's head, made him promise through signs to stay with Doc no matter what happened, then climbed onto Henderson's wagon beside Blackwood. "Let's go get our town back," she said. And as 20 riders and 3 wagons rolled toward Echo Ridge with rifles loaded and determination hard as stone, smoke kept rising from the burning church, and Reed stood watching his work with that gentle smile, not knowing that this time, finally, justice was coming for him. Not from the law he'd bought and paid for, from the people he'd terrorized into silence. And silence, it turned out, had teeth. We came down Main Street in 2 columns, rifles visible but not raised, not sneaking, not hiding, riding straight into the heart of Hammond's power with the whole town forced to watch. The church was fully engulfed now, flames eating through the old timber frame like it was paper. Maybe 100 townspeople stood in a loose circle around it, kept there by Hammond's men with rifles. Forced witnesses to what happened when you defied Oswin Hammond. Hammond himself stood on the church steps that weren't burning yet, Carlton Price beside him. And there, watching the flames with that gentle smile that made my blood run cold, was Francis Reed. Sheriff Cobb saw us first. His hand went to his gun, but Deputy Collins was faster, his own weapon already drawn and aimed at his former boss. "Don't," Collins said quietly. The crowd stirred, confusion, then hope, then fear as they realized what was happening. We were maybe 30 armed people facing Hammond's 20, But numbers don't tell the whole story when half your men are just scared loggers who never signed up for killing. Blackwood rode forward, his marshal's badge catching the firelight. Oswin Hammond, Francis Reed, you're both under arrest for arson, murder, and conspiracy. Hammond actually laughed. On whose authority, Marshal? You're wanted yourself in Dakota Territory. Got the warrant right here. He pulled papers from his coat. That warrant's a lie, and you know it, Blackwood replied. But these aren't. He held up Jacob's ledger pages. 3 years of documentation, every fire, every murder, every piece of land you stole, all in Jacob Wilson's handwriting, witnessed and dated. For the first time, Hammond's confidence cracked. Wilson's dead. Can't testify. Don't need him to, Doc Montgomery called out. I witnessed half of what's in those pages, and I'll testify to all of it. Me too, said Henderson. And me, Martha Wilson added, her voice strong. One by one, people in the crowd found their voices. People who'd been silent for years. People who'd watched their neighbors burn and said nothing. They were done being silent. But Reed just kept smiling. He pulled out a pistol, smooth, practiced, and before anyone could react, he had it pressed against the head of Reverend Walsh's youngest daughter, a girl of maybe 6 who'd been standing too close. Now here's what's going to happen, Reed said in that soft voice. You're all going to put down your weapons. You're going to let Mr. Hammond and myself ride out of here, or I'm going to put a bullet in this child's head, then set fire to every building on this street with all of you inside them. The girl was crying, silent tears running down her face. Her mother screamed. The crowd surged forward, then stopped as Reed pressed the gun harder. I mean it, Reed said. I got no particular attachment to living, but I surely do enjoy my work. Test me. This was the moment. Everything balanced on a knife's edge. We could rush him, but the girl would die. We could let him go, but he'd kill again. There was no good choice, no clean answer. That's when Clyde did something nobody expected. The boy had been hiding in Doc's wagon like he'd promised. But he climbed out now, walked straight through the armed standoff, and stood in front of Reed. Then he started signing, fast, urgent, desperate. What's the boy doing? Hammond demanded. Eliza's face had gone white. He's testifying, right now. In front of everyone. Boy can't talk, Price sneered. Don't need to talk to witness, Blackwood said slowly, understanding dawning. Territorial law says testimony can be given by sign, writing, or any means the witness can communicate. He looked at Reed. And that boy witnessed you burn Eliza Granger's home, saw you murder her husband and daughter. Under frontier law, eyewitness testimony from a minor is admissible if corroborated by physical evidence. Which we have, Doc added. The fire-starting kit I found, the ledgers, everything. Reed's smile finally died. His gun wavered. Furthermore, Blackwood continued, his voice carrying across the crowd, that boy's been legally adopted under territorial custom, makes him family of the victim. Under blood debt law, still recognized in this territory, he's got the right to demand justice. Public justice. Right here, right now. That's not, Hammond started. It's exactly the law, Doc interrupted. Old law. Tribal law that predates statehood. A wronged family can demand judgment from the community before assembled witnesses. It's binding. The crowd was murmuring now, people remembering. It was true. The old ways, the frontier ways, they still held weight when territorial law failed. So here's what happens, Blackwood said. This community judges, right now, public verdict on Oswin Hammond and Francis Reed. Every person here gets a say. That's the law you wanted to use against Mrs. Granger. That's the law we'll use against you. Reed still had the gun to the girl's head, but his hand was shaking now. Not from fear, from rage. His whole careful plan falling apart. Put the child down, Eliza said, walking forward slowly. You want a hostage? Take me instead. No, Reed said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Clyde kept signing, kept testifying. Every gesture another nail in Reed's coffin. And then, impossibly, Jacob Wilson's voice rang out from the back of the crowd. I ain't dead, Hammond, and I got more copies of those ledgers. Sent them to the territorial governor, the federal marshal service, and 3 newspapers. It's over. Jacob stepped forward, his face bruised and bloodied but alive. You left me for dead in that fire, but Henderson's pulled me out, been hiding, making sure those documents got where they needed to go. Hammond's world was collapsing, and everyone could see it in his face. Community votes, Blackwood declared, all in favor of arresting Oswin Hammond and Francis Reed for their crimes, say aye and step forward. The silence stretched like pulled wire. Then John Henderson stepped forward. Aye, Martha Wilson. Aye, Doc Montgomery. Aye, Deputy Collins and his 4 deputies. Aye. One by one, the whole crowd stepped forward. Even people who'd taken Hammond's money, even people who'd been too scared to speak before. Every single person. A united front. Hammond's men looked at each other, then started lowering their weapons. They weren't dying for a lost cause. Reed saw it happening, saw his world ending, and in that moment, his finger tightened on the trigger. But Clyde moved faster than anyone thought possible, throwing himself at Reed's legs while Eliza grabbed the child he'd been holding, yanking her away. Reed's shot went wild, and before he could aim again, 20 rifles were pointed at his chest. It's done, Blackwood said quietly. Justice is served. Reed looked at the circle of guns, at the crowd of witnesses, at Hammond who was already trying to run and being tackled by Henderson's boys. And finally, Francis Reed stopped smiling. They bound Reed and Hammond with rope, good hemp rope, the kind meant for pulling timber, the kind that don't break easy. Sheriff Cobb surrendered his badge without a fight, knowing when he was beat. And as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning frost, Echo Ridge finally looked like a town that might be worth saving. Eliza stood in the center of it all, Clyde pressed against her side, and I saw something in her face I hadn't seen in 3 years. She looked like she was standing in the present instead of haunting the past. Mrs. Granger, Blackwood said, approaching with something in his hand. Found this in Hammond's coat. He held out a ring, gold, worn smooth with years of wearing. Woman's wedding band. Eliza's hand went to her throat. That was Mercy's grandmother's ring. I kept it in my jewelry box, the one that burned. Reed kept trophies, Blackwood said quietly, from all his fires. We'll find more when we search his room. The rage that crossed her face was terrible and beautiful. But then Clyde signed something, and she looked down at him, and the rage softened into something harder and colder. Resolve. They'll hang, she said. Not a question. They'll hang, Blackwood confirmed. That's when Reverend Walsh pushed through the crowd, his face red with righteous indignation. Now see here, this is mob justice, lynch law. These men deserve a proper trial, not like the proper trial you were going to give my boy. Eliza cut him off. When you tried to take him from me, Walsh sputtered. That was different. That was about the child's welfare. That was about Hammond paying you, Jacob Wilson said, stepping forward. His burned face was set hard. I got the receipts, Reverend. $300 to file that custody petition. $500 more if you succeeded in getting the boy placed with a proper Christian family, which happened to be Hammond's sister in Cheyenne. The crowd went silent. That's a lie, Walsh protested. I would never. I got your signature on the bank drafts, Jacob said flatly. Hammond kept copies of everything. Insurance, he called it. Making sure nobody could turn on him without implicating themselves. He looked around at the crowd. Reverend Walsh wasn't the only one on Hammond's payroll, but he was the worst, using God's name to steal a child. Martha Wilson's voice cut through the murmuring. The church fire, that wasn't Hammond sending a message to us. That was him destroying evidence. Walsh kept Hammond's payment records in the church office. Walsh's face went from red to white. I was trying to help. That boy needed proper guidance, proper education. That boy needed someone who'd feed him, Eliza said, her voice low and dangerous. Someone who'd see him as human instead of charity work or a commodity to be sold. He's my son now, legal and binding. And if you come near him again, Reverend, I'll forget I'm a Christian woman. Doc Montgomery stepped forward then, and in her hands was a leather-bound journal. Found this in Walsh's buggy. Thought it was a Bible at first. It's not. She opened it, started reading. July 1886, OH. Requests pastoral visit to Granger property. Assess value. Report back on family situation. She looked up. This goes back 4 years. Every family Hammond targeted, Walsh surveyed first. Told Hammond who was vulnerable, who was isolated, who nobody would miss. The crowd's mood shifted from shock to fury. People who'd confessed their sins to this man. People who'd trusted him with their deepest fears. And he'd sold every word to Hammond. "I was saving this town," Walsh shouted. "Hammond brought prosperity, jobs, the railroad. Without him, Echo Ridge would have died." "Without him," Henderson said quietly, "my son would still have 2 good legs. Without him, 43 people would still be alive. Without him, we wouldn't be standing in the ashes of our own church, wondering when we traded our souls for timber money." Deputy Collins moved forward. "Reverend Walsh, you're under arrest as an accessory to murder, conspiracy, and fraud." Walsh tried to run, didn't get 10 feet before 3 loggers, men who'd worked for Hammond but were done being his tools, caught him and dragged him back. They put him in rope next to Hammond and Reed. 3 men who'd destroyed a town from 3 different directions: greed, violence, and corrupted faith. As they were being loaded into a wagon for transport to the territorial jail, Hammond finally spoke. "You think this changes anything? I own half the politicians in this territory. I'll be out in a month." "Maybe," Blackwood said, "but Jacob's ledgers are already in the hands of 3 different newspapers and the Federal Marshal Service. Even if you buy your way out of jail, your reputation's done. Your empire's done. You're done." Hammond's face twisted with rage. "There's things you don't know, Marshal. Things about that land. About why I needed it." "What things?" Eliza demanded. But Hammond just smiled, a broken, terrible smile. "Let's just say the Granger property's worth more than timber and shoreline. Let's say there's a reason I was willing to kill for it. And let's say that reason ain't going away just because I'm in jail." The wagon pulled away, carrying 3 men to their judgment, but Hammond's words hung in the air like smoke. Blackwood turned to Eliza. "What's on your land? What could be worth all this?" "Nothing," she said. "It's just forest and lake, same as it's always been." But Clyde was signing frantically, pointing toward the lake, toward where Eliza's cabin had stood. The boy's eyes were wide with urgency. "What's he saying?" Blackwood asked. Eliza watched her son's hands, her face going pale. He says the night of the fire, before Reed came, there were other men on the property, men with equipment, digging near the lake shore." "Digging for what?" Clyde made another sign, one Eliza had taught him just days ago when they'd found a pretty rock by the water. "Gold," she whispered. "He's saying they were looking for gold." And suddenly, Hammond's obsession made terrible, perfect sense. The territorial surveyor came 3 days later, a thin man named Hutchins, who'd worked the Montana goldfields back in '64. Took him 2 hours with his equipment before he came back to where we were all waiting. Seemed like half of Echo Ridge had followed us out to Eliza's land, curiosity being stronger than good sense. "There's gold," Hutchins said simply. "Rich vein running along the lake shore, maybe extending under the water. Could be worth, well, considerable." You could have heard a pin drop in that crowd. Every eye went to Eliza Granger, standing there with her son's hand in hers and the ashes of her burned-out life scattered around her feet. "How much considerable?" someone asked. Hutchins looked uncomfortable. "Conservative estimate? $250,000? Maybe more." The crowd stirred. That was more money than most of us would see in 10 lifetimes. Enough to make Eliza the richest woman in the territory. Enough to buy and sell Hammond's entire empire twice over. "Well," Carlton Price's voice came from the jail wagon where he was still waiting transport. "Reckon that changes things, don't it? All that talk about justice and dignity, but now she's rich. She'll be just like Hammond was." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at her burned cabin, at the town that had turned its back on her, at young Clyde who was signing questions he couldn't hear answers to. "Marshal Blackwood," she said quietly, "what's the law say about mineral rights?" "Property owner holds them," Blackwood replied. "It's your gold, ma'am, legal and clear." She nodded slowly. And what about town charters? Can a private citizen establish a trust? Doc Montgomery stepped forward. You thinking what I think you're thinking? I'm thinking, Eliza said, her voice carrying across the crowd, that Hammond destroyed this town chasing gold that weren't his. Killed my family. Killed 43 people. Near about killed all of us. She looked around at every face. I'm thinking that gold's got blood on it already, and more blood won't wash it clean. What are you saying? Henderson asked. I'm saying I'll take enough to rebuild my cabin, enough to make sure Clyde, she pulled her son close, gets proper schooling, even if he can't hear. Enough to live decent. She paused. The rest goes into a trust, for Echo Ridge, to rebuild what Hammond burned, to help families he ruined, to make sure no one else has to choose between dignity and survival. The crowd was dead silent. You're giving it away? Martha Wilson whispered. After everything you lost? Not giving it away, Eliza corrected. Giving it back. This land's been here longer than any of us. Gold's been in the ground since God put it there. Hammond thought he could own it, kill for it, make it his. But some things don't belong to any one person. Some things belong to everybody, or they belong to nobody at all. Blackwood was looking at her like he'd never seen her before. Ma'am, you sure about this? I'm sure I don't want to become what I hated, she said firmly. I'm sure my Josiah and little Mercy didn't die so I could sit on a pile of gold while my neighbors starve, and I'm sure, her voice caught, I'm sure Jacob Wilson died trying to save this town, not make one woman rich. From the jail wagon, Hammond laughed, bitter and broken. You're a fool, widow. That money could have made you powerful, respected, safe. Eliza turned to look at him. I got a son who loves me. I got a community that finally found its backbone. I got a man, she glanced at Blackwood, something passing between them, who's talking about staying in Echo Ridge permanent-like. I got everything that matters. She walked over to the wagon, looked Hammond straight in his defeated eyes. You killed my family for gold, killed 43 people, destroyed a town, and you'll hang for it, knowing that all that gold you murdered for is going to rebuild everything you tried to tear down. That's my justice. That's my vengeance. Living well and doing right. Hammond's face crumpled, not from fear of hanging, but from the realization that he'd destroyed everything, including himself, for treasure that would never be his. 3 weeks later, they hanged him alongside Reed and Reverend Walsh. I didn't go. Didn't need to see it. Some of us need to watch evil die. Some of us just need to know it's dead and move on. But I did go to the ceremony 6 months after, when the new church was dedicated, built with Granger Trust money. And I saw Eliza standing with Silas Blackwood, both of them wearing simple gold bands. Saw young Clyde Blackwood now, adopted legal by both of them, standing between his parents in a new suit, grinning like Christmas morning. The boy who couldn't hear had a family who listened. The widow who'd lost everything had built something bigger than what was taken. And the town that had been silent too long had found its voice. As the sun came up over the lake that morning, warm June sun, nothing like that terrible December, I watched Eliza and Silas and Clyde walk down to the water's edge. Watched them stand there together, the three of them, looking at the place where everything had almost ended. Then I watched Eliza take off the leather cord she'd worn around her neck for 3 years, the one that held her first husband's ring, and bury it under a young pine tree they'd planted. Not forgetting, just making room for what came next. Clyde signed something, and both his parents laughed. The sound carried across the water, bright and clean and full of tomorrow. Some stories end with revenge, some end with justice. This one ended with something harder and better. It ended with grace, and that, I reckon, is the only kind of ending worth the telling. Now I've told you about Eliza Granger and Marshal Silas Blackwood and young Clyde, and about how a town lost its way, then found it again. Told you about Hammond's greed and Reed's evil and Reverend Walsh's betrayal. Told you about gold in the ground and blood on the snow and justice that came slow but came sure. But what I ain't told you yet is what it all means. So let me tell you plain, the way an old man should. First thing, dignity ain't something you inherit or buy or get handed to you. It's something you claim for yourself and defend in others. Eliza could have run, could have sold out, could have taken that gold and disappeared to San Francisco or Denver, lived rich and alone, but she stood her ground, and in standing, she kept her soul. That's dignity, and it's worth more than all the gold in Montana. Second, family ain't always blood. Sometimes the people who birth you ain't the people who raise you. Sometimes the people who raise you ain't the people who save you. Clyde weren't born to Eliza, but he was hers, sure as sunrise. Love makes family. Choice makes family. Standing together when the wolves circle, that makes family. Third, justice might be slow, but it ain't deaf. 3 years Eliza waited. 3 years Jacob gathered evidence in silence. 3 years that town pretended not to see evil walking their streets. But truth's got a way of surfacing, like bodies in a thawed lake. Might take time, but it comes. Last thing, and maybe most important, it ain't never too late to do right. Doc Montgomery waited 3 years to speak up. Martha Wilson waited 3 years to stand beside her neighbor. That whole town waited until they couldn't wait no more. They were late, but late courage is still courage. Late justice is still justice. Maybe you're listening to this and thinking about your own regrets. Times you stayed silent when you should have spoke. Times you turned away when you should have stood firm. Times you chose comfort over what was right. I'm here to tell you, it ain't too late. It's only too late when you're dead, and if you're hearing my voice, you ain't dead yet. Eliza rebuilt her cabin on that same piece of ground where everything burned. Could have moved, could have started fresh somewhere else. But she stayed, because running from your past don't heal it. Standing in it, building something new from the ashes, that heals it. The Granger Trust still operates today, 70 years later, built schools, funded widows and orphans, helped families, Hammond ruined, get back on their feet. One woman's choice to give instead of take changed a whole territory, and young Clyde grew up to be a teacher for deaf children, spent 40 years helping kids like himself find their voice in a world that don't always listen. The boy who couldn't hear taught hundreds of children that silence ain't the same as having nothing to say. Silas and Eliza had two more children after Clyde, girls, both of them, named Isabella and Mercy, names that honored the dead while celebrating the living. They're grandmothers now, and their children's children still live on that land by the lake, still benefit from the trust their grandmother started, still tell the story of how one widow stood against an empire and won. Not with guns, though she had them. Not with money, though she could have had plenty. But with something simpler and stronger. The stubborn belief that doing right matters, even when, especially when, everything's telling you to do wrong. So if this story touched something in you, friend, I'd be honored to know where you're listening from. Maybe you got your own Hammond to face. Maybe you got your own silent years of waiting. Maybe you're the one who needs to speak up, or the one who needs to hear that it ain't too late. Whatever your story is, I hope you heard this one and understood. Winter always ends if you're tough enough to see it through. Families made by choice more than blood. And dignity, real dignity, that's something nobody can take from you unless you hand it over. Until next time, may you stand tall when it matters, love fierce when it counts, and never mistake quiet for defeat. This has been the story of Echo Ridge, Wyoming Territory, winter of 1889. The story of how a widow, a marshal, and a deaf boy reminded a whole town what justice looks like when ordinary people find extraordinary courage. And if that ain't worth remembering, I don't know what is.